Good evening. I'm David Yezzi, and I'm delighted to be back at the studio school. I always adore coming here. It's particularly nice to be in the same building with the beautiful Giacometti show that's happening downstairs. Can you hear me? Is this reaching you in the back? Good. I'm especially pleased to be here with Fulvio Testa, whom I've known for many years now, and whom I met at Karen Wilkins' dinner table. He was sitting next to my wife, Sarah, and they really hit it off. And subsequently, we saw a lot of Fulvio, I'm delighted to say. Since then, Fulvio and I have had an opportunity to collaborate in the book arts, of which Fulvio is very involved. And he produced a beautiful etching for a letterpress edition of poems that I was involved with. And so when he asked if I would be here with him tonight to talk about his work and larger matters, I jumped at the opportunity. Fulvio's topic. Fulvio, what is the title of your topic tonight?
Well, I didn't want just to speak about my work because I think the work has to be just seen. And so with David, I thought, to talk maybe about freedom and freedom of the artist. So it's an important topic and very often quite abused also. And
well, I wanted to, so freedom of the artist. When Fulvio mentioned this, I immediately I'm often kind of redirecting things from a poet's point of view. And I thought immediately of John Berryman's book, Freedom of the Poet. John Berryman's 100th anniversary is this year. He was born in 1914 in October. And just shortly before he died, tragically, he signed a contract with Farrar, Straus and Giroux for a book of essays called Freedom of the Poet. Sadly, he never wrote an essay called Freedom of the Poet. And so one wonders what Berryman would have had to say on that topic. And I think it would actually have been very similar to what we'll hear tonight as Fulvio describes the freedom of the artist. But certainly from Berryman's own work, which started with an homage to Mistress Bradstreet and went on to the crazy, jazzy dream songs, to the wonderful essays of Shakespeare. Here was someone who constantly found freedom in their work. So, okay, freedom and the artist, it's a narrow topic.
No, I
so
think.
How did this? Tell me, what are we talking about?
I think it might sound actually ambitious, and also because freedom is a word. It's a strange word. Also, for example, I was interested by the fact that in Italian, my language, there is just libertà. And in English, you have freedom and you have liberty. And for example, I think in English you can say, I take the liberty of doing something.
Yes.
And so in Italian, we use very often the words libertà. So it appears very often, but it's less defined in some ways. We can say, mi metto in libertà, I take off my shirt. Mi metto in libertà, I take freedom, so I get naked, mi metto in libertà. Or you say, disegno a mano libera. There is a technical drawing and freehand.
Right.
And so there are a lot of, but it's...
So back up. So basically in English, we have more words for freedom.
Probably two.
So freedom and liberty.
Yeah.
And how are those different?
Well, I mean, there is a kind of, the word freedom is very abstract, but it's also contradictory, because, there is a very, and I told you about this, I was in London just recently, and I saw an exhibition of photographs taken by Dennis Hopper at the Royal Academy, and there is a phrase that you wrote. It says, "For me, that movie," it means Easy Rider.
Yeah.
It's about freedom and the responsibility you have of being free. So you have a combination of freedom and responsibility, and it's a completely contradiction. So there are two opposites. So it's for this reason probably I like this the duality. And I can take an example. I mean, if we think about Gauguin, 19th century, he was a successful broker. He had money, he had a nice house, he had a wife, he had a child, a collection of important paintings, and he gave up everything, little by little. He was really sucked by something else, which was the desire to create. And he sacrificed everything. I mean, he abandoned the work, the house. He became quite poor. At times he had money, but he was, we cannot say that he had money. He sacrificed the wife. We cannot we could easily condemn him, but there are people who kill the wife if so.
Well, isn't he giving up liberty? So now he can't
go
to the opera, he can't, have a family, he can't own a house.
No, but there was, I think, in Paris in the second half of the century, of 19th century, a kind of call to values. It was, values because art had become a commodity. Van Gogh was the same. He was an art dealer, a young art dealer. In the family of Van Gogh, you had 4 different art dealers. And little by little, he became what he became. So, and I think Van Gogh and Gauguin are quite 2 examples of, people, of persons, of artists who sacrificed everything for what they were believing in. And so very free from obligations, But free from obligations doesn't mean that you are free from responsibility. And so I'm very much fascinated by this aspect. This is why, what I try to talk about is it's more about questions. It's not really, I don't have answers. I'm puzzled by this. And
first of all, it may be worth kind of making some distinction, and you tell me if you agree with this. But from what you're describing, I certainly understand what you're saying, but it seems to put the life in some ways in a kind of, an antagonism or a life versus the art.
It's a fight. It's not an
Right.
well. It's
So I think we all kind of feel
Sure.
that in different ways, right? So how do we continue to make ourselves free enough to produce work? At the same time, we need to eat, we need to survive. So, but let's say that whatever. So here's Gauguin and Van Gogh who are making real sacrifices, I think, in their life, in terms of conventional life, in terms of their families, leaving that behind in order to adopt more freedom
social structure.
for their work.
Well,
But here's what I want to get to, and I think this is what's interesting. So, okay, yes, those sacrifices have been made for more freedom in the work. So, but within the work, where now all this freedom has been bought through great sacrifice, there is still restrictions.
well, this is exactly the point. In history, from the Egyptian time, there have been transgressions, but not transgressions in order to, be just destroying, but there were, let's say, transgression in order to change. I don't know if somebody here has seen, not just in picture, but the Nefertiti, which is in Berlin. It is absolutely just worth to go to Berlin only to see that sculpture. And that sculpture was done in the 14th century before Christ. And for a short time, Akhenaten, so the pharaoh, created a kind of revolution. And he tried to get rid of all the gods. And he tried to break the rules. And he had hundreds of workers, artists, but the artist of that time was not the artist in the sense of the Dürer term. And he pushed them just to express themselves. And and again in Berlin, in Charlottenburg, you have images of heads done 3,300 years ago. And they are unbelievable because they're not very different from the Gothic heads of the cathedral. So it's not that in the Egyptian time they were not able to see things as for what they are, but there were conventions. And so in history, there have been conventions that have been changed, sometimes drastically, sometimes slowly, sometimes, you go back because corruption brings a lot of changes. In Rome, first century BC and first century of our era, they have done fantastic things, extraordinary things. It's enough to go to the Metropolitan Museum to see and then there is a corruption. And from the 3rd century to the 5th century, you see how there is, instead of an improvement, it's like, it becomes poorer.
Yeah. You've mentioned to me before, and it's interesting, could you talk a little bit about the example of Masaccio in this context?
Masaccio, Masaccio was born at the turn of 14th and 15th century. So he worked in the first 20 years of the 15th century. And so he died at the age of 28. he couldn't express much. But he broke completely a barrier, and he make walk to people, and you can feel that they are walking. It's not like before.
So you're talking about the images in the
Brancaccia,
Brancaccia.
yeah, sure.
And so what makes those images different?
Well, he breaks the rules, but then there are other rules coming in. And with Leon Battista Alberti and the origin of the Renaissance, basically you create different rules, and you create the value of the perspective. You enter into a space, you create a space, you study a space. You know, if you go to museum, or if we go to museum, we see that there are a lot of annunciations. You know, the annunciation was a theme in the 15th century, in the Renaissance, that was very much connected with esotericism. You say esoteric?
Yeah.
And it's all about measures, you know. It's all about mathematics. How the Annunciation's paintings were created were just mathematic, filtered with mathematic ideas. And, you know, and then a century after, again, we have a kind of corruption. Like, you know, it's very interesting to see what the Manierists have done. But they didn't have anymore a clear idea of in order to proceed.
Okay, so let me ask you now. So, in terms of these specific examples, what you're describing for the artist is that you, let's say, you're an artist, you arrive at a moment in time, you have certain received conventions. I think probably all as artists we feel that to some degree. Now, but here's my question. So, but first of all, let's kind of recapitulate. So what you're saying is that then partly or mainly, the aim of the artist is to find the value in breaking the rules of received convention. Is that true?
Well, yeah, yes, you have to recognize that you cannot avoid breaking the rules. So, you know, it's very interesting because Picasso had this phrase. He said, I don't search, I find, you know. In nature, everything exists already. The only thing that doesn't, it's not always there, is the consciousness. And when you acquire consciousness, then you enter on, and you become, you enter on another level. For example, Dürer, who died exactly 100 years after Masaccio, you know, and who had all the Renaissance, the high Renaissance behind when he died, but he is probably the first to be completely aware. So he has a consciousness of the role of the artist that many others didn't. I mean, you know, you have great artists. That was a time when you had, just to name somebody, you know, there's Leonardo, there's Titian, there's Raphael. Well, Raphael died a few years before, but you know, I mean, the time of Dürer was an unbelievable time when you couldn't go to Venice or to Rome in a couple of days. But ideas were moving fast. I don't know, because of the time.
We're doing fine.
Yeah.
I want to leave enough time to
Right.
to look at images, but I think if we talk for another
No, maybe we can
10 or
just
15 minutes.
no, because maybe we can. I don't want to. You see, I brought 3 aspects of my work, and maybe I just talk a little bit about how I came to these aspects of my work. I didn't study art. When I was a child, my parents moved to a beautiful place, beautiful old villa in the countryside. I was born in Verona, but don't be mistaken. It was a beautiful villa where nobody wanted to live. It was isolated. My father was an high officer of a lost war, so, you know, he gave up everything. He tried to become, I don't mean a peasant, but there were some people working for him. And I spent a lot of time in the attic where, you know, you have no idea, the books, objects, and so on. And so I had a very rich childhood. So although I didn't have a culture, you know, there were a lot of books in my family, but you know, I didn't go to theater, I didn't go to opera. There was no television. You know, it was a quite isolated experience. When I grew up, I wanted to study art, and I was denied that. So you have to study Latin, you have to study mathematics and this and that, which I did. And I studied architecture, which I always loved. And but I was not very lucky in timing. Studying architecture in 1968 in Italy was like going to a strike reunion, you know.
There were no classes.
There were no classes. I mean, I was lucky to be to have as a professor, but I didn't learn much from him. Actually, I learned 2 things, and very important, I will tell you. I was studying with Carlo Scarpa. You probably, or at least I hope you have seen the exhibition of glass that was last year or this year at the Met. Scarpa, from him, I have 2 very important things that I learned. One, how you may I have your pen. How you should use your pen in the hand when you draw.
How you should hold the pen?
Yeah. And the second, or even first, actually the first one is before you start to draw, always wash your hands.
Why?
It's a sacred thing. This is my reading, you know. Going back to liberty, the sacred, it's part of the liberty, you know. I mean, it's enough to see the exhibition of Giacometti, and you can see how much he was trying to learn from Cézanne, and there is a drawing of 1923-24 of the fruits. And those fruits, you know, if you look at Cézanne or you look at Giacometti, what he did with his drawings and paintings, you know, it's like a table. It's like, how you say, altar, like in the church. I don't know if you have seen, I think it came out a couple of years ago, or 3 years ago, a film, a documentary by Werner Herzog of the La Grotte Chauvet, a grotta, a cave, recently discovered probably 20, 25 years ago in the south of France. And so they were able to film in this cave that has never been open to the public, and they found a kind of altar, and on this altar there was a skull. You know, it's not very different from the heads of Giacometti. You know, the heads of Giacometti become a kind of hologram. You know, you can see that there is a sculpture because you can almost imagine the back of just the drawing. You know, there's something unbelievable. So I think again, they look like free, completely free, like scribbles. You know, but there is they are. Let's call them scribble, but they are much more than that.
But he doesn't use just one decisive line, Giacometti.
Well, Giacometti it's a you know, very interesting case. He was a very good friend of Bacon, and in a way they have many things in common, although it's a completely different world, you know. There is a small video, or no, at that time there was no video. It's a film, and a conversation like the one that we are having. But the difference that was that Giacometti was working, and at the same time he was talking with Giorgio Soavi, who was a friend and a critic and a writer, Italian. And, you know, and you can believe him or not, but Giacometti will say, I'm not able to draw. I try, and I don't get the line, you know. And so...
Why?
Well, because if something moves, has no line, you know, he sees things in the space, and it's exactly the same thing that happens with Bacon. Bacon creates a kind of theater. Bacon, before becoming a painter, just around you know, the Second World War, he was working with a decorator who was also a lover, and he was a successful decorator. And a few years ago at the Tate in London, I've seen a collection of objects that he had designed, or, you know, and he loved to create screens, you know. And already, you know, if you look at the work of Giacometti, of Bacon, he creates a platform like this, and there is an imaginary screen that, what does make a screen? A screen creates a room into a room. And if you look at the drawings of Giacometti, you know, he also needs, not only Giacometti, Rembrandt was doing the same. He needs a kind of frame. So, you know, they have this idea of the freedom of the page. They don't. They have exactly an idea about the composition, but it's not enough. They put rules. So
well, let's think about that. I want to look at some images, but to kind of get into them, something that Fulvio and I talked about, and there's a corollary kind of in the world of poetry too, where you see poets, and this is not, this will sound like a criticism, it's not really, but if you take, for example, the current poet laureate of the United States, Charles Wright. Charles Wright is a wonderful poet. In many ways, he's inherited a lot of the best of the style of Ezra Pound. By his own admission, when he was in the war, he traveled around Italy with a copy of Pound in his pocket, and he absorbed these poems. They became very important to him. And so when he writes his poems, they have always kind of incorporated a kind of a texture and language that he has kind of adopted from Pound, all to the good, wonderful poems. And yet, if one could level a criticism, he has written essentially, and I think he would agree with this, the same poem for his entire career, decades and decades, 30, 40 years. And the poem hasn't really changed. In fact, he's stopped writing poems, except for, he's a handful here and there. Because he's done. He basically has, he's not pressing on to anything new. He feels like he's starting to repeat himself. And I think we all kind of know as when we work, when that danger creeps in. And so I want to preface these images that we're about to see with the idea that Fulvio, in my experience and in talking to him and in the values that he's been describing tonight of freedom and of kind of breaking rules and in finding the value in being able to break those, has never settled for a single style or a single medium. So with that in mind, let's maybe look at a few images as we kind of move into these. So this is very early, I guess.
Well, yeah. This was not actually
Does that say 1913? That's really early. Oh, yeah, sorry, 80.
This is 83.
Yeah.
I came to, you see, just before I just tell you something, I was lucky that being unhappy, at that time you wouldn't use the word depressed, but I was unhappy. Because I was disappointed with my study in Florence. I moved to Venice because it was close home, but not because I needed my mom or, but it's because I was feeling that I had to do something else. And I met a painter from Prague in a gallery that was a very good gallery in Verona. Verona is a small town with a great history, but nothing with modernity, or at least, but it was a center for, let's say not a center, there was a very famous town for artists. You would live, I don't mean cheap, but anyway, it was not expensive, and with a rich history, especially for books. And so I met a painter from Prague, his name was Stepan Zavja, and he was also doing illustrations. When I met him, I was painting. I was drawing a lot. I had two favorites at that time, Malevich and Giacometti. The opposites, because one is, in my view, dogmatic, and the other, instead, it's about dogmatic also because it's very close to the icons. And so he creates modern icons, but everything is on the surface. In Giacometti, I had seen in Paris, just a couple of years after his death, an exhibition, and I was struck because again, it's, I mean, for me, it's quite moving. And I have, you know, I'm lucky that I have a small Giacometti, an important one in Italy. You know, it is really, you can feel the space, as I say before. So I was lucky that I was offered the possibility to get involved with children's books. In a way, I had some talent, in the sense that at once I had.
But now, Fulvio, sorry to, but I think we may be getting ahead of ourselves a little
Okay.
bit. Let's change the image and see.
Yeah. But anyway, these are the things that I did when I came to New York, '82, and I mean these are watercolors.
When did you first come?
Well, I came in the '70s the first time, but to stay
In the early 80s?
in the '81.
Yeah. Okay.
And the rest, okay, this is also an old piece. It's '84. And these are old papers. In Verona, because of the history of publishing, I was able to find paper that, you know, with beautiful watermarks of paper of 15th and 16th century.
Can you zoom in on the mountains in the background there? Because I think that's interesting in terms of the images that we'll see in a little while.
Well, but I think I go back,
Okay,
I go
good.
further, yeah.
Yeah.
They are not in chronological sequence. So the first, we are lucky that they are of my first year in New York. The rest, you know, this is probably beginning of 2002, 2003.
Wow. Beautiful.
They are all watercolors. Some I mix also ink. This one, I was just now creating my inks. It was a mixture of different inks. I never use pencils. So when I start, I don't know where I go. Basically, I let things happen, and I have only to control. This is the end of the 90s, 2004.
And is this, for this image, for example, when I look at your watercolors from this time, and maybe I assume, and maybe wrongly, that these are very consciously landscapes.
Well, there are landscapes because there is an horizon, sorry.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But, you know, if there were no de Kooning or Pollock or Rothko, probably I wouldn't do it this way. So,
Why do you say that?
well, because they are at the same time they are completely abstract. I don't want to make a landscape. It becomes a landscape. Whatever I do, I'm not free. You see. And you know, I can show you something. You know, I enjoy just to go, and there are all accidents. Of course, this is.
So there's this. There are passages of the paper that have no pigment. Is that right?
Well, that hasn't. That they all have pigment, but
red?
I show you some that don't have pigment. But it's again,
like
it's
right there.
it's only because.
I like using this.
Okay, this is an old paper. This is a 15th century paper, and you see that it is folded in 4 parts. This was supposed to be a letter, never written.
And from what year is the paper?
Well, they're from 15th century.
Wow.
I was invited to spend 2 months at the Albers Foundation in Connecticut, and this is the work that I have done there. But of course, it's not Connecticut. You see, paper, watercolor, the color is the least important. The first is the paper, the second is the water, and third is the brush. And well, this is an image, so it's I always I always was fascinated by deserts. I traveled a lot, and I've been in deserts. I have taken a lot of pictures, but everything gets into a drawer. It's not that when I'm working, I look at images.
Now, what year was that last, the desert image?
That was 83. Yeah, so
also
very early. Yeah, here we are back to old paper. You can see that there is a lot of ink.
So far, the desert image is something of a breakthrough, because in the early paintings, there's a lot more representation of tree branches and so on. The desert is just
I would say that I
abstract.
started to do even more abstract, just a line. In the 70s, I was fascinated by the drawing of Van Gogh. And, you know, and
Wow.
And I was also fascinated by Rothko. And believe it or not, for me, Rothko, it's in the last work that he did, the black and white composition separated in 2 parts. They were completely landscape, at least I see them that way. It's a deformation, personal deformation, probably. Okay, these are also the early 80s, and I was using old paper and experimenting possibilities. But there is always in my, or the most of the time in my work, a kind of passage through open space. And as you have seen, it is in the beginning, in the cityscapes, and even there, because you see, this is okay. For me, you have your pen?
See, I told you want this.
Well, how do you use it?
You want me to do it? Okay.
Yeah, just the top.
Oh, here.
Yeah, exactly. That's it for me. Is just the the meaning of the work.
But now I want to get back to an idea I want to slow things down too much, but I think it's an important idea. So, you don't start with the pencil. You start with the brush. You go right into
In the center.
the paper in the center, and then you said but then your work is to control. But this is a talk about freedom. So what does that mean, to control?
Well,
no, tell me a little bit about.
No.
Because I think I agree with you.
Watercolor means water. And when I say the paper is very important, because the water run on the paper, and not all the papers are made with the same consistency and so on. So there are different. See, there are river that are of one type. I was canoeing, so I know all that.
And you canoed like in the Olympics?
Well, almost.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, wild water.
Whitewater.
There are connections with watercolors, at least the way I work, because there are a lot of layers.
It's about controlling water.
A lot. It's like a slalom, you know.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of layers, a lot of coats of, and depends, as I say, from many different elements.
So how many layers are we looking at here?
This is one of the maybe I have just 2 or 3.
Yeah.
But this one is probably 15.
Yeah. And that you would do 15 layers over the course of how long would that happen?
Well, the brush works for maybe 6-7 minutes all together.
So
But the actual process it takes hours.
So this is 2 or 3 hours, you think?
Well, it has to dry. Yeah, I don't have a phone or you say a phone? No, air dryer.
Yeah.
No, I just walk in the room, you know, with like this. It's again. Are you familiar with the Van Gogh of the prisoner in you know? And I saw that painting in Russia. And I never forgot that. So, in a way, I'm doing the same. In a way, I'm prisoner in my studio or room, but I'm free at the same time.
So, but it would be a lot faster, except you have to wait for a
Well,
to dry, and then there's a kind of dry brush on top.
It's not dry, but there are some spots, for example, that I tend to keep. For example, you see this, because of the paper, I can control and I can avoid to get color on something that I want to keep completely
So right here,
clear.
there's no pigment here.
Right.
And so you've preserved that spot,
Exactly.
but then you've gone back and you've highlighted
Exactly.
it,
There is
low-lighted it by putting this mark
water
next to it.
or very light pigment went.
And that's happening kind of throughout.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I use also a paper to dry and so on. So it's a long process.
Well, I know that the tissue paper that you use for drying has a big effect on some of the nudes. Maybe we could, I think just in terms of time we need to, maybe let's look at some nudes.
I go back to, no.
Beautiful, look at that.
Well, these are done last summer.
Wow.
And there is another aspect, maybe I go fast, but you know, I learned in the early 90s to draw a body. I didn't go to school. I didn't do that until the end of the 80s. I was mostly involved with a lot of books, but I have been also, I had exhibitions, also in museums, also here in America. I was really doing 2 different things. And then I started to do the third thing. And actually, there was a fourth, because at the end I will show you some etchings. But in the early 90s, I started to work a lot with models. And if I just paint a landscape by heart, I need a model to be free. because I'm not really just trying to you will see the images.
So the landscapes are made. You don't work from photographs or from.
No.
These are all you.
Totally. But
Yeah.
these are, this was done this year. These were a few years ago. Here I had a friend posing for me. She didn't want to get naked. And when I work with a model, I just work with the pencil. And then when I am alone, I just work with the watercolor. Sheila was doing the same. And, you know, it's, I learned just to create a volume with the line. I mean, it's exactly the opposite of Giacometti aim. But, you know, I'm fascinated by the line of Picasso for sure. And I'm fascinated by the fact that, you know, this is also freedom. The fact that, you see, this, the nipple in that body is just a scribble. But seeing that context, it becomes more than a scribble.
And can I ask you, I know that the etchings you do only in Verona, and you split your time between Verona and New York.
Yeah, well.
Do you work on nudes and landscapes at the same time? Are they in different places?
No, I tend to work only on one medium at a time. When I was working with books, with illustrations, I've always illustrated my story, besides Pinocchio and Aesop fables, and working with Anthony Burgess, Clockwork Orange. I always wrote my stories, or I'm not a writer, so my stories are more visual. Of course, there is a text, but
and these are children's books that are your stories for the listeners.
Yeah, but if I work with, of course, with the life drawings, yes, I can work with other things. But if I'm working with oil, I just work with oil, watercolors. When I was doing books, I worked for 4 months. Maybe just with the children's books.
I know you have some etchings for us to look at, but also I think we'd like to invite the audience to ask some questions.
I know that you are. Just one more thing. Oh, that's a completely different thing.
That looks fun.
Well, this is with the moon in where I live. Okay, I think I don't know. Maybe I show you something. Just one moment. But maybe, yeah. I want to show you. Well, it disappeared. It disappeared.
There they are. Right there.
Here they are, yes.
Yeah. On the bottom, yeah. So show the first one in the book, all the way over. Yeah.
Well, this is
show the book, yeah.
Well, this is a book that I will actually.
This is amazing. I saw this. There's at the Grolier Club tomorrow night. There is a reception for the publication of this book. Each volume, I think there's 25, has an original.
No, there are 90 copies, and so there are 90 watercolors.
90 original watercolors. Wow.
In each book has bound in it one original.
Wow. So, but this is, and it's extraordinary. I saw a copy at Fulvio's house this week, but this, just to give you a sense, in addition to everything else that Fulvio does, and I don't think that there's even been an occasion in the presentation tonight to look at Fulvio's children's books, which are amazing. The New York Review Books edition of his Pinocchio with a text by Jeffrey Brock is extraordinary and beautiful. But these are these are etchings that Fulvio's made for fine press editions, mostly of poetry, that he has been working on. There was just a show in Mexico City of these last year.
Yeah.
And so this is another aspect of the work, yeah.
Oh no, it's okay. The other way. Yeah, these are well, you cannot really call them illustrations. They are very small edition. Sometimes only 25, sometimes 75 copies, and connected with poets. I've been working a lot with poets. The book, the first one that will be presented tomorrow, just yesterday somebody bought it to donate it to the Morgan Library, so that was a good thing for me. And it's also a special book because it is printed with the same press used for the first edition of James Joyce's Ulysses.
And the poet and critic who wrote the catalog for the Giacometti show downstairs, WSDPRO, is someone that Simone has worked with.
You are
a couple of
great
cases. Well, no,
public
it's
relations.
It's a nice connection. No,
okay.
It's my job.
And this is for a book that I have done with Serge Gavronsky. It's a good friend of mine. Okay, I think that's it.
Good.
For what concerns the images, for sure.
We have time for a few questions. We've seen a lot of different work. Would anyone have a question for